All right, well, welcome. Thank you for attending our workshop, Stormwater Guidance Manual, Strategies for Privately Owned BMPs. So my name is Francesca White. I am a project manager and owner at Evergreen Stormwater. I am also our MS4 compliance lead, and I am located in Bellingham, Washington. So my role for this work, I was the lead author of this manual, and I'll be presenting today with my colleague, Tylor.
I'm Tylor Hoffman-Ballard. I am a research lead at Evergreen Stormwater. My role in this project was to provide kind of a segue from the effectiveness study that was conducted before this manual was started. In my spare time, I also inspect these as a third-party inspector.
So before we get going, there were a lot of people that came together to do this work. So I want to take a second to acknowledge all of those. The lead entity was Yakima County. This project was funded by an ecology gross grant. As you can see on the screen, there were several manual authors, contributors, and we had a wonderful technical advisory committee that helped us out along the way. Just a quick overview of what we're going to do today. This manual has 9 chapters. We're going to be providing a high-level overview of each chapter. We're also going to include some examples. We have some recorded case studies from different permittees that we interviewed and volunteered to share some of their lessons learned. We have 2 mini breaks built in, and then there is a 15-minute conference break at 3. And then we're going to wrap up by doing a field inspection demonstration. It's just about a 5-minute walk away that Tylor will be reading for us. Okay, so we compiled all the information, talked to permittees, reviewed documents, but at the end of the day, those that are running these programs and inspecting BMPs, you already are, or you are the ones that are going to be the experts on this. So we have pulled together some questions. We're going to use Slido, and that is basically as we go through these strategies, we're going to do a poll in the room to see what is actually popular among us. And then this is just a great opportunity. I know by looking at the attendee list, we have permittees from both Eastern Washington and Western Washington. So this afternoon is also an opportunity for you all to ask questions of each other, share lessons learned, things that work well, or that are challenges with your jurisdictions. So hopefully some of these questions will prompt that. You can join Slido using the QR code. I apologize if it's too far away. Come up here. It's not an app, it's all anonymous. You're oh. Okay. Do you want to write down, should we write down what the pin is?
Yeah.
So people can do that. Okay, so we will go ahead and write down, if you can't use the QR code, and the QR code does re-pop up for every slide that there's a question on, so you'll be able to see it again. But we'll add, no, okay. The QR code we can come back to when we get to it. Is anybody able to use it right now? Yes. Okay, so let's see. We're actually going to start off with the first question, just to get everybody into this. So which best describes you, so you can get an idea of who's in the room today? So we have permittees, regulators, consultants, vendors, or other. Yeah. Can I just get a brief show of hands? I can't see the number about how many people in the room are able to get on. Okay. Okay, so just looking up at our results, they're still coming in, but it looks like about half of people in the room are permittees. We have some regulators, a few consultants, and then you don't have to, but if anybody is other, you want to shout out what it is, feel free. Okay. So many people come in. All right. So that's kind of where I thought we would be. So I guess we can just keep this in mind as we continue going through the presentation.
All right, so I'll start off with giving a little bit of a background for the manual. Here we go. All right. So before we started the manual, we were conducting the inspection and maintenance responsibilities for privately owned effectiveness for privately owned facilities effectiveness study, and that was conducted for Yakima County to meet their effectiveness study requirements. That study was looking at which inspection and maintenance strategies were the most effective. We surveyed a number of different jurisdictions in Washington and other states. What we ended up finding was that there were 10 different combinations that people were using in terms of inspection and maintenance strategies. There really wasn't any clear pattern of which strategy was the best, as well as we didn't really identify any element of any program that was most important for any particular jurisdiction. So we ended up recommending as part of that study was to develop a guidance manual to assist permittees with developing inspection and maintenance programs for BMPs on private property. So we wanted to provide permittees all the different options that we had encountered and they could kind of pick and choose from that manual based on what their needs and priorities were within their jurisdiction. So I mentioned strategies, but I also mentioned elements on that last slide. We, during the effectiveness study, collected elements of programs that were considered part of successful programs from the literature. And that's what's on this slide. We've grouped them into a couple different categories. We have resources and access, O&M protocol, training and E&O, documentation and record keeping, and incentives and enforcement. Resources and access is related to having appropriate equipment available, having access to BMPs. So then for O&M protocol, training and E&O, funding is also important, staff training, having E&O training materials developed, and then O&M protocol being provided to BMP owners is another important part of that. When it came to documentation and record keeping, successful programs had current and complete documentation. Their process was easy to use. They communicated BMP responsibilities to owners, and then owners were able to easily demonstrate compliance. And then when it came to incentives and enforcement, some successful programs provided incentives, and then jurisdictions had mechanisms in place to enforce those requirements.
Okay, so as I mentioned, there are 9 chapters. These are all just different program elements that go along with building a program to inspect and maintain privately owned BMPs. We'll be walking through each one. Just want to give you an idea of the audience for this. So we wrote this with a very broad audience. We have no intention that someone is going to pick this up and read it cover to cover. But the idea is that if you are a well-established program, maybe you're just looking at 1 or 2 chapters because you want some ideas on different funding, or if you are just stepping into a new role, you don't have as big a stormwater background, you can pick and choose the chapters that you need to help build this. So just keep in mind, it's a very broad audience. For some, a lot of this material might be straightforward, but it might not be for others. So both the Eastern Washington and Western Washington Phase 2 permits require ongoing long-term operation and maintenance of BMPs. This includes both BMPs owned and operated by the permittee, but also private BMPs. So our manual focuses on the private section. As Tylor mentioned, there are a whole lot of strategies that are used by different jurisdictions. So the scope of this project was going through, we used data that we pulled from the Yakima County Effectiveness Study. We did several literature searches, and then a large portion of this was interviewing different permittees from both Eastern Washington, Western Washington, and some neighboring states that have similar requirements, and pulling that all together. So this is by no means a manual to tell you what to do, but more to give you an option of things that you can pull to help either build or improve your programs. So as I mentioned before, a lot of work from a lot of different people went into this. So we had a technical advisory committee This made up representatives from both Eastern Washington and Western Washington permittees, representatives from ecology and WashDOT, and then we had permittees from Idaho and Montana. And then all together as a group, we were made up of stormwater program managers, stormwater technicians, inspectors, permit writers, and university faculty. So I mentioned before, our lead entity was Yakima County, and then you can see all the supporting entities on our screen. Okay, chapter 2, the first one we're actually going to start on. So this is the inspection and maintenance strategies. This chapter describes the importance of BMP maintenance and inspections, and then also provides the different strategies for both of these for BMPs on private property. So why are BMP inspections important? In the state of Washington, if you are developing and disturbing over a certain amount of area or have over the threshold of hard surface, you're installing structural BMPs on this site. We all know that the first step is installing structural BMPs, but what's really important in order for our receiving waters to continue receiving that benefit, they need to be maintained. So inspections allow the permittee to go out, ensure that this maintenance is actually occurring, to work with property owners if it's not occurring, and then also gives this opportunity to build relationships with these property owners and to continue to educate them on the importance of stormwater and these BMPs. So in both permits, we have different types of inspections. So we have construction phase inspections and post-construction. This manual just focuses on post-construction inspections and maintenance. We have divided these strategies into 3 categories that focus on who is doing the inspecting. So that is the permittee is inspecting, the property owner is inspecting, or a qualified third party. And then it's important to note that some jurisdictions use a combination of these strategies. So in the Eastern Washington permit, you are required to inspect these BMPs after construction once every 5 years. And then in Western Washington, you're required to inspect these BMPs on an annual basis unless you have an approved alternative schedule. Okay, just taking a poll again, what strategy or strategies does your jurisdiction use for inspecting BMPs on private property? Awesome. So some more answers might trickle in, but this actually supports what we found. So the first strategy that we'll go into is the permittee inspects. So this is when the permittee conducts a site visit on private property and assesses the BMP to ensure that it's functioning as designed. In the Yakima County effectiveness study, as well as other studies we looked at, this was the most popular strategy among permittees. So we're just going to highlight a couple of program elements and the things to consider when possibly developing these programs. The first one we'll dive into is identifying the BMPs requiring inspection. So obviously, before you can even begin inspecting, you need to be able to locate, identify, and map all of these private BMPs. So both in the Eastern Washington permit and Western Washington permit, mapping all of these connections to the MS4 is required by August of this year. There are a couple of acceptable formats that ecology is accepting. So that's CAD, GIS, or if you have another software that can map points, lines, polygons, and has associated attributes. So once you have that all pulled together, something that you also may want to consider is just reviewing previous inspections reports. This gives you an idea if you have specific BMPs or property owners that you might have some challenges with, and can give you an idea of just how much effort is going to go into inspecting each of these BMPs. Another component to this strategy is communicating with the BMP owner. So prior to the BMP inspection, you are going to need to communicate with the property owner. And the most common methods with that are either sending a letter in the mail or email. Some permittees can have the property owner attend voluntarily. And then we've actually talked to some permittees who have been requiring the property owner to attend the inspection. If the property owner is not attending the inspection, it's really important that you communicate with them prior. You want to make sure that this BMP is accessible and that you can actually get to it. Some people don't even realize they have a BMP on their property. So communicating where it is, that they understand this, the importance of why we're out here maintaining and inspecting. And then lastly, this just gives an opportunity to ask if there have been any challenges or issues that this property owner has been experiencing with their BMP. So I want to highlight that as part of this manual, we have provided a lot of examples and templates in hopes that if you are starting to develop this program, you don't have to start from square one. So in Appendix 2A, we have collected some examples of templates for notifying property owners for both inspection and maintenance. Then obviously the elements of inspecting the BMP. So BMP should only be inspected by trained staff. Often when you are out, you are using something that is guiding that BMP inspection. So whether that's an O&M manual, sometimes those O&M manuals are used to build a checklist. This can be either in paper copy form, or the pattern that we're seeing is we're transitioning to using some type of software that you can use on a tablet in the field. Make sure you are documenting all of your observations and non-compliances. And then one thing to highlight is a situation where an owner may refuse property access. So speaking to permittees on both Eastern Washington and Western Washington, this has been very rare, but there are some instances that has occurred. So when developing a program, thinking about building a policy and a process for when this is going to happen, making sure that you are consulting your legal team throughout developing that process, and that all of your staff are trained to make sure that they know how to handle that situation. It's also really important to document this. If you are attempting to inspect a BMP and you cannot because of property owner issues, that's something that ecology would like to know. So make sure you're documenting when this happens. And then lastly, the element that we describe in the manual is following up. So this may be if, well, you're following up to deliver all of these inspection results, you're developing that paper trail for yourself and for the property owner. And then also if maintenance is required, you're outlining what that needs to be, when it needs to be done by, and then you may also schedule a follow-up inspection, and that would be the time during this correspondence to do that as well. In Appendix 2C of the manual, again, we have templates and for emails or letters for follow-up inspections as well. So the second strategy that the manual briefly covers is property owner inspects. So this is when you have homeowner associations, private business owners, or individual property owners inspecting their own BMPs to assess if maintenance is needed. So this was the second most common strategy in the Yakima County study for people outside of Washington state. So in Washington, it is defined in both the Eastern Washington permit and Western Washington permit that BMPs must be inspected by qualified personnel. So I have the definition that is the same in both permits here on the screen. One thing I do want to highlight is that and/or volunteers. This is not the situation where your neighbor down the street raises their hand and says, today I want to be a BMP inspector. So this is somebody that needs to have the qualified experience, and that in this situation should have approval with whoever you're working with for ecology. So you think, why would we have this? So in Washington state, the property owner should not be conducting their BMP inspections. We include this in the manual and highlight this because If you're looking at other reference material, if you happen to be a jurisdiction that is neighboring another state and you're looking at the other ways people do things and this comes up, we are highlighting this because it is done in other states around us, but it should not be done in Washington state. So the third strategy that we highlight is when a qualified third party inspects. So specifically in the Eastern Washington Manual, in lieu of requiring continued property access, you can have a qualified third party inspect the BMP on an annual basis and submit a certification that maintenance is occurring, the BMP is functioning as designed. So this is one that is often combined with other strategies. So we include it in this guidance manual. We'll go over some elements that are a little different than just when the permittee is inspecting. So first is developing that third-party inspection requirement. So you as the permittee may decide that you want to allow this as an option or even a requirement. The other part to consider is who's going to be hiring the third party. Is the permittee going to be hiring the third party, or are you going to leave that up to the property owner? Whichever path you choose, it's really important that this is documented. I have looked at several different codes with Eastern Washington permittees specifically, and a lot of these types of requirements are documented in code. So that is the best place to do that. Something that you also want to consider is that in the way that you document this requirement, to make it so that the property owner is still liable for the functionality of the BMP. So regardless of who they hire to inspect, or we talk about this also with maintaining, specifying that regardless of who that is, you as the property owner are still liable for the functionality. Hopefully this helps if there are any disputes to try to minimize the finger pointing in those situations. Next would be defining or documenting the third-party qualifications. So you as the permittee can specify the qualifications for these inspectors or also for maintaining. Speaking to different permittees, there were a couple of different strategies that were used. So 3 that were highlight. One is just defining the minimum knowledge for the O&M standards. So that also might be specific to BMPs in your jurisdiction, making sure that they know the design standards and the operation and maintenance standards for these BMPs. A second option is requiring a third-party certification or training. For example, ASCE has an inspection and maintenance certification that you can get by taking their training. And then the third option that I have seen both permittees from Eastern Washington and Western Washington use is actually developing a list of pre-selected vendors or contractors. So you can go through and find people that provide these services in your area and go ahead and make a list of these different services. And I will repeat again, for all of these lists I have seen in both Eastern Washington and Western Washington, there is always a disclaimer on them that says you as a property owner are still liable for the functionality of the BMP. Inspecting the BMP is not going to have its own slide. It looks very similar to the permittee doing it, only it's a qualified third party. So they're trained, they're documenting everything, most likely using some type of checklist or an O&M plan. They are recording all of the non-compliances and then reporting this back to the property owner and to ecology, or sorry, to the permittee. And then lastly, another program element you may want to consider implementing would be spot checks or follow-up inspections. The 2 common reasons we have found that permittees have done this are A, you're just getting some funky inspection reports back and you may want to go out and just verify that maintenance is actually happening. And then if there is a physical complaint about a BMP.
All right, so we'll switch to maintenance strategies now. Over the past decades, current design standards have focused on on-site stormwater management. More BMPs have been installed on private properties, especially commercial, multifamily, and subdivisions. Previously, these BMPs did not require inspections, and permittees weren't necessarily able to confirm that they were being properly maintained. And properly maintained BMPs are more likely to continue functioning as designed. That lack of proper maintenance can result in stormwater pollutants bypassing the facility and going down to your receiving waters without treatment. So this is why BMP maintenance is important. So to start off, the 3 maintenance strategies that we identified during the study, as well as combination, are up on the slide. We have the permittee maintaining the BMP, they're the one performing the maintenance. We have property owner maintaining the BMP, and a qualified third party maintaining the BMP. What was fairly common as well was a combination of these strategies that was reported during the study. So I'll try to note when we especially saw that as I page through the next couple of slides. The button doesn't get stuck. All right. First, which strategies does your jurisdiction implement for maintenance? For non-permittees, which strategy are you most familiar with? So we have permittee maintains, property owner maintains, qualified third party maintains, a combination, or other. So it looks like we've got a majority of property owner maintaining, with next most popular being combination and permittee maintains. Interesting. Okay, getting back to maintenance. We'll start off with talking about when the permittee maintains. This would be when the property owner provides the permittee access to BMP, and that permittee performs maintenance, including providing the necessary equipment and labor. Some of the program elements include developing prioritized categories, developing maintenance agreements or other contracts, identifying BMPs requiring maintenance, notifying the property owner that maintenance is going to be occurring, and then actually performing the maintenance. So I'll step through those in the next couple slides. So first we have developing prioritized categories. The reason we start with this is this was the least common strategy reported in the effectiveness study. And every time it was reported, it was used in combination with another strategy. What tended to happen was permittees would elect to provide maintenance just for high priority BMPs. And those could be BMPs located upstream of a 303D, a TMDL, or other sensitive water body. It could have also been where there was a proprietary treatment technology requiring like specialized treatment or specialized training or equipment. Or it could be where you might have a BMP design or maintenance that was a little bit outside of the norm. Then lower priority BMPs would be maintained by the BMP owner or by a third party. So the next element is developing maintenance agreements or other contracts. This would be where the permittee would provide maintenance for, or they would use these to provide maintenance for facilities. They would define who maintains, what the required maintenance is, and the maintenance frequency. The permittee may also choose to cover the costs or collect costs from the BMP owner. This would be specified in the agreement. Then we have identifying the BMPs that require maintenance. These would be identified through issues identified during inspections. It might be also just according to some sort of seasonal or other frequency. Permittees can create a maintenance action list using items from that inspection list. And they can also take from documentation where a BMP may have been non-compliant. And then some permittees choose to perform maintenance just generally, like I said earlier, on a specified frequency, regardless of those inspections. Next element is notifying property owner of maintenance, and I'm not going to speak too much about this just because we've covered this for the inspections. It's very similar. When the property owner is notified of maintenance, an inspection report might be referenced or some other documentation. And then the last item is performing the BMP maintenance. So this is where trained staff should be performing that. Common materials that might be used for outlining what maintenance is required include permittee developed checklist, BMP specific O&M manuals, the maintenance sections of the Eastern Washington and Western Washington manuals. And then something to note is that maintenance should or must conform to the standards in the Eastern Washington and Western Washington manuals, or according to the manufacturer's specifications for proprietary devices. Before I move on to the next strategy, some of the advantages of the permitting maintaining include the permittee has control over the BMP that might be, say, closest to a sensitive water body, so they can protect against a greater threat from their water body. They're more likely to ensure that proper maintenance is maintained or proper maintenance is conducted for that BMP. They're also more likely to have access to specialized equipment if that's needed. One of the drawbacks of this strategy is that it is very costly in terms of staff time and resources. It may require additional training for existing staff. So next strategy I'll cover is when the property owner maintains. This is when homeowners associations, businesses, or individual private property owners perform maintenance for their BMPs on their property. The elements of this strategy include notifying the property owner that maintenance is required, conducting education and outreach, and requesting records of BMP maintenance. Disappear. Okay. So I'm going to skip over notifying the property owner. That's similar to what we covered on the previous maintenance strategy, as well as the inspection strategy, where the property owner might receive a notice, the mail, via email, and it might reference a recent inspection report. The next element is conducting education and outreach. So the permittee might elect to conduct efforts with these BMP owners before they maintain the BMP. Those ways that they might send out the information include one-on-one training in person. Those might include workshops. It may also include social media or some other form of media. And then it may also be provided in terms of like a manual that the city develops or jurisdiction. And operation or education and outreach is described more in Chapter 9, so we'll get to that later this afternoon. The last element is requesting records of BMP maintenance. Some permittees require BMP owners to submit records for proving maintenance. These records might include an inspection checklist, a list of which maintenance actions have been performed, or photos. It's important to develop a system to track and maintain those records, depending on what they come in as. And then it's also important to note that that documentation proves that maintenance happens, and that's important.